This is the Self-Taught or Not podcast with
Dylan Israel
and Eric Hanchett, where we teach you the do's and don'ts of software development from two software development professionals, one self-taught and one not.
Let's jump in there. So if there's one thing I like to do, it's rant. And that's a little bit of what we're going to do. A little bit of ranting today, a little bit of explaining about things that I don't think, technologies and choices I think developers are making mistakes with, and why. So it's a little prep for what's about to happen, I guess.
Let's hear it. Let's hear it. I want to hear these. We haven't done any prep before this episode, so I'm not even sure which ranty things that Dylan's going to say today. So we'll see if we agree or not.
So one thing like my subscribers will get me hyped up about is asking me about like Bootstrap and jQuery. And so I have a very strong stance on these things because I live in a black and white world in software nowadays, because I don't think we can give people's choices because they don't make the right one. And so let's take Bootstrap for an example. Bootstrap served a purpose where, hey, it gives us some nice styles. It gives us just we don't have to worry about that aspect of our code. And then it gives us a responsive grid. The issue I have with Bootstrap is that then people use Bootstrap for 10 years, never learn how to do media queries, and they don't know CSS because they've just been chaining Bootstrap classes together for decades.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on this. I think you're not going as far to say people shouldn't learn jQuery and Bootstrap completely, but you're saying that you have to go beyond the Bootstrap and jQuery world.
Yeah, and so to me, it's so like this is sort of a larger conversation where you start adding things to the core language. And so like Bootstrap existed for a couple of reasons when it first started gaining popularity. One, it was a pain to do responsive design. And people are like, oh, this column grid system makes sense. It seems to be easy. You create a row, you create a column, and put a dash number on it. Great. I get that. And that was good for a time. Nowadays, you can do Flexbox. You use CSS Grid. It has gotten easier and easier and easier. And then there's also Sass to make our CSS a little bit easier. But issue I have is people are still using this item instead of ever getting better and learning new things.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I have a little story to tell. So when I started doing web development seriously and as a profession, I was really, I did a ton of back-end development for years, and I had done front-end development maybe in the early 2000s, and then I kind of quit, and then I started back again after I was done with my back-end development career. And so I kind of skipped those years where everybody was jQuery crazy and you had to do everything in jQuery, and Bootstrap was kind of fading out because, like you said, Flexbox and Grid, I think maybe it was out then, started becoming more and more prevalent. And so I was lucky that I didn't get into this phase where, you have to learn jQuery for everything. And of course, I did an interview, like I think that first year when I was trying to transition over to do the back end to front end. And the first assignment was, okay, here's jQuery, here, do a bunch of manipulation. And I felt dumb because I was like, oh, okay, well, this is pretty easy. I haven't done a ton of jQuery. So I was like looking up in the middle of the interview how all the different jQuery methods, and like, oh, this is pretty easy. I don't have a problem doing this. But I could see, I almost felt bad using jQuery because I was at the point then, it was like, aren't we supposed to be just using plain document, get element by IDs and query selectors instead of using jQuery for everything? But this company was still using it. So I had to do the interview that way.
Yeah. And I typically don't have a problem with any of these technologies. My issue is that a lot of developers never actually go and learn CSS. They never go and learn sort of JavaScript and sort of how to manipulate the DOM. And then they become masters of a library instead of learning fundamentals. And so like jQuery is a great example of like, it solved a lot of like, hey, we want an easier way to manipulate the DOM, something shorter, great. And then that was sort of king. And we want an easier way of doing asynchronous calls, because anyone who's ever had to do Ajax call like traditionally, and you had to set all that up and handle different statuses and all, it's a pain. It's never. So jQuery came along and said, hey, no, just do like .json or .git. I spent so long since I even touched jQuery, I forget exactly, but that even's been deprecated. Oh, just use the fetch API. that's native now. But what I sort of drives me nuts with these technologies is people become so reliant on learning them that they never learn the foundation. So when a new framework, and we're talking about the front end right now, when a new framework comes along that solves some of these issues like Angular, React, Vue, whatever it may be, they are so uncomfortable in it that they never actually leave it. And so before you know it, you have people doing jQuery inside of Angular components that are breaking lifecycle hooks and that shit that doesn't need to happen. And it drives me up the wall.
Have you ever had to deal with an Angular code base with jQuery in it? I have once. I'm like, let's get this out of here. Let's not use this.
Yeah, and so the crazy thing is like most of the time, if they just did like a 15-minute Google search, they're like, hey, I don't know how to add a class dynamically. You literally could Google dynamically add a class Angular component, and it would show you. And then you wouldn't have to do jQuery. Or how do I select something from the DOM in Angular or React? All these things have been added to these frameworks and aren't going to have sort of these complications. Another thing about sort of jQuery around the subject that drives me nuts is if you're trying to test it, it's very hard to test it in terms of because everything is happening sort of in the background, piece by piece, instead of just sort of structured as these other frameworks are. And if they're getting injected in there, it's adding another level of sort of shadow DOM that you can't even really manipulate.
Yeah, I wonder if I've never tested jQuery type code or how you would do that. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's just you would test the methods that you use, that input outputs. I don't know.
I mean, the truth of the matter is testing is sort of a relatively new thing for a lot of developers. Like it's been around for maybe 10 years, but it's really picked up last 5 or so. And so like when jQuery was jQuery and there wasn't Angular JS or Angular or React or like, any of those have sort of taken off. No one was writing tests like that, like not in the front end anyhow. The front end's always been like that Wild West where it's getting sort of a little bit of disrespect, and it's not considered up until recent times, I would say, not considered like real programming almost.
Yeah, I think back in the day, it definitely wasn't. But
I mean, I know I've interviewed candidates on that where they're like, hey, this is a full stack role. You ask them about sort of SQL, they do fine. They get to the HTML, CSS, JavaScript sort of stuff, and they have no idea. I remember one guy saying, I'm not really much of a pixel pusher or something like that. And I was like, okay, I like what do you want me to say? This is part of the job that you got to do. I guess this is done at this point.
Yeah, I think there has been a little bit of, I don't know. Let me think about this. Definitely a lot of people look down on the front end a little bit. Like real programming is getting to the back end and using algorithms and that HTML front end, you're just creating designs and plugging everything in and pixel pushing. And it's with modern day front end frameworks, you're writing as much code in the front end as you are on the back end. And it does take some thought and some good architecture and ideas to put it together the right way.
Yeah, we'll probably touch on this in our front end versus back end versus other podcasts. But to me, and maybe I'm biased because majority of my career I've done front end, but I've also done back end. To me, there's more moving parts in the front end. Like you have to handle how things look, which is pain. You have to handle browser compatibility, which is just as much of a pain. And the front end is growing and changing much more rapidly than a lot of back end technologies. Where I guess that's really JavaScript in general, but it's also growing in features very rapidly, whether it's service workers and you might have to handle builds and bundling as well. So I saw a tweet from some established developer, I forget it was, and he's like, never in my life did I think we'd see a front end that was more complex than a back end because there's so many moving parts. Now there's a lot of moving parts in the back end, but sort of like it makes sense and it's less logical. And I've always had this funny thing where the closer you are to the client, the worse it is to code it. And sort of the front end lives in that realm.
I have a rant. I'll jump in here. So have you heard of, there was a NPM module that broke the internet?
I did hear about that. I'm trying to remember what the name of it was, but it was part of like 85% of dependencies.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the name right now. LeftPad. So if you don't know the story, there was this LeftPad is like this really simple library that like manipulates. I think it like manipulates a string. It's a really simple process, but it happened to be used in literally thousands of npm packages. And the way npm works, which is the node package manager, is that you have these packages that anybody on the internet can create. Anybody can create. You just throw it up on GitHub or version control system, and the node, I think it has to be some Git type package management system, but you can link it inside Node, and Node has this registry of all these packages. But what happens is a lot of packages are created with other packages. So you have this dependency tree, like a lot of times, like maybe 2 or 3 deep, probably even more deep, where one package relies on another package that relies on another package, relies on another package. So LeftPad, so this apparently this programmer, a 28-year-old Azer Kokulu, decided to do a patch on it, and he basically broke LeftPad, which is this little piece of programming. This does the string manipulation that ended up breaking thousands of npm packages out there. And what bothers me about this is how like terrible Node is as a package manager, where it's literally has thousands of these packages that rely on other packages, and one programmer can literally break thousands of projects when he makes an update because one project's relying on another project. And it's, I think we've heard about dependency hell, where when you're if you've worked in a software product for a while and you need to start upgrading your framework or upgrading in components in your framework, and you find out, like, if I upgrade this package, it actually breaks this other package, and then you have to run your npm audit, which is a command where you can see like what packages, like there's security risks in some packages that'll show up. There's this command called node command update, NCU, which you can do to check each package to see if they need to be updated, but you have to be careful when you update one of them because it might break another package or it might break your app somehow. It just feels like there has to be a better way of doing this.
So like,
I don't know.
For the dependency aspect, the thing that I like to do is I like to update my dependencies always. So like when I do, and now this isn't always my choice. I've only worked at one company who's like, Angular updated today, we update today, where they wrote a script that would auto update the packages, and then you handle any issues associated with it as part of your PR. And if you do that, yeah, you have to deal with some breaking changes, but it's better to deal with it sooner than later than have to deal with 5 of them breaking at a time. But far and few between. Sort of I think the old school mentality is that it works, so don't mess with it.
Yeah, I guess the point I'm making is not that, well, first, that is a pain. So if you have any project you're using React, Vue, or Angular, it's going to be depending on a bunch of different packages, and then just keeping those packages up to date, keeping the framework up to date is sort of a pain, especially in the Angular world, where some of these frameworks get upgraded every 6 months. But the other pain, I'd say, is just how fragmented and broken Node is, the Node package manager, and how these things can happen in the future. And it feels like it's just a bunch of spaghetti code dependencies upon other crappy dependencies. And I think we're going to see more LeftPad issues going forward in the future.
Yeah, and I tend to agree. And I think part of that reason is like, it's one thing not to reinvent the wheel. Like the other day, we needed a rich text editor. I was like, let's just use a rich text editor library to handle that. But there are things like, this is another thing that drives me absolutely insane. And there are things like Lodash that exist where it's literally people who are not comfortable in JavaScript just go and import a bunch of methods for things that they shouldn't have to import methods for. I see this method called isArray in my code base, and it drives me nuts that people are using that to see if it's array or is empty. It's like, bro, just check that it's empty. And if you sort of take this healthy approach where let's not just find a piece of code for everything, where you're like, I'll write a simple piece of logic where like whatever LeftPad was doing, if it was simple string manipulation, you probably didn't need a library to do that, in all honesty. And you can avoid a lot of this stuff.
I think LeftPad was literally like 10 lines of code. I've gone back and forth on this issue with Lodash. I've worked with developers that are like masters at Lodash. I
but
worked with a contract.
don't know how to work in JavaScript. That's
He,
the
was-
problem.
yeah, I mean, maybe you're right. He was he was okay at JavaScript, and he was really good at Lodash, and he was able to just put all these in. But I see your point. You should be able to do a lot of these methods without it.
And it's sort of my stance with PHP is like when I first started learning PHP, I'll never forget what my boss said. He's like Wiseman once said that in PHP there's a method for everything, and like that's not a good thing. Programming languages, in my opinion, should be short and concise, and they should give you tools rather than like built out features, right? You should understand that there should be fundamentals to a programming language, and you should use those fundamentals to get what you want. Now there's exceptions, right? You have things like our maps and our filters and stuff like that, but those should be far and few between.
If you do use Lodash, it does add some. I think it's tree shakeable, so it's gonna add a little bit to your bundle size depending on what package you use. But I'm not as hard on Lodash, but I definitely can see where people are using it as a crux and not being able to do without it.
Yeah, it's I wish I could not take a black and white stance on this, but what ends up happening is you say, hey, I'm just going to use Lodash for this one thing. Well, in reality, you could just go see what Lodash is even doing, put it into your project, and then you don't even have to maintain a dependency. You're like, you break it down. You could probably even make it better, make it more readable, refactor it so that people don't have to go and see I don't want to have to go see what this zip method is doing. Write a function that tells me what it's doing. I can look at it, and in case that, then now we don't have to manage a dependency as well. Yeah. All right, I left Eric speechless. He doesn't want to defend the Lodash community.
No, I can't argue with it. It's solid advice. If a lot of these times you don't need these libraries to bring in, you can probably write plain JavaScript to do the same thing, and you probably learn something too when you try to re-implement this. Let me ask you this: have you ever been in a sophisticated enough company that actually creates their own JavaScript libraries or components that they reuse between project to project that you can just easily pull in?
Yeah, so two companies actually. So the one I'm currently at, they have a jQuery component library and a React component library, and they're working on an Angular one right now. And a lot of times, at least both these companies, they're for like back office tools. They're not necessarily for client side stuff. These are things to help, maybe manage your, some CRUD tool that manages users or manages your e-commerce platform in the back end. And a previous company did the same thing. Built out in that case, it was a private npm repo where we built out a component library so that, like, we probably shouldn't have to keep reinventing a modal every single project or a tooltip or how we're going to wrap an HTTP package, whatever it may be. But yeah, and it's something that I'm very passionate about because so many people will either build something and then take additional time on, like, we shouldn't have to rebuild these things. Like, certain things are easy enough that you should just, hey, someone wrote it, it works well, it looks the same throughout the entire application, and we're good to go.
So what's the difference between like a company's internal library where they put some of these methods or components into their own library versus one from Lodash? Is it just because Lodash has tons more but you should use the ones from the company?
I mean, Lodash, we're talking about logic, while we're talking more so about like a component library. So like, I have no problem with people using component libraries as long as they don't abuse them, but they do. That's the problem. I've had Angular developers come in and say, hey, we need to make a modal, and they go get the Angular material modal, and I said, no, we can't. We don't use Angular material in this project. It's client facing. We need it to be custom, and we need to be able to modify it. And they shut down. They have absolutely no idea even where to get started. And you see that a lot where it's pretty easy once you go into code bases to see if someone just copied and pasted some crap from Stack Overflow into there and they was hoping it was working. And that's a lot of these people who are stuck on not being able to ever create something from scratch, where all they do is install dependencies and all they do is sort of copy pasta the spaghetti code around. So like, to me, it's those things are great, and I've used them in projects. But you should be able to anything you use, you should be given enough time be able to create a working version of it.
We had a deadline on a project once. It was like 6 months. And we were like, okay, we need to build like tooltips and modals and like a lot of that stuff that you see in those like Bootstrap or Angular material frameworks or React material frameworks. So we went back and forth, and at the end of the day, we're like, can we just bring in Angular material? And all the developers are like, okay, let's do it. So we just brought the whole package in and started using it. And hindsight, we probably may have not needed all of it to bring in. Probably didn't need Angular material to do a lot of things we were doing, but it made it so much easier to like get it out within like the time frame we needed. But I could see your point. If you have some time, you want to do it right. That may not be the best bet.
See, and the thing about the time aspect is, and I'm a strong believer of this, is that most of those components aren't that hard to create. Like there are some that are more complex than other, right? You want to have like a data visualization component. Obviously, that's going to be very complex. But we're talking about tooltips, or we're talking about modals or cards, or these are things that you can create in an hour or two. But the issue is that so many people have relied on these technologies that they've never done it once. You say, hey, I need you to go build a modal from scratch or a tooltip. They don't even know where to get started, because since day one, they've gone and used libraries to do this, and they've never done anything like it from scratch. That's why I'm so adamantly against a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, it brings down the skill of the developer. I mean, I've definitely been in places where it's like, okay, we need this. Okay, bring in this NPM library that we've never heard of. Hopefully it's okay. Let's do this with that. Oh, you want to bring this in? Let's bring in this whole UI library to do everything we want. So you end up just sort of kind of grabbing different pieces from different places and putting it together. But when you need to start customizing it, I've customized Angular material. We talk about Angular a lot because me and Dylan are both Angular fans. We've done a lot of it. And it's not easy. You have to like do ng deeps on some things. You have to overwrite a lot of custom fields. I mean, if you want the out of the box Angular material, or you want to change the colors, that's one thing. But when you want to start changing functionality, it becomes difficult.
Yeah, and like the business always wants what they want that day. And you're like, oh, well, it worked today. But they always change how things look. They always change how they want additional features. And then you're sort of stuck on, instead of actually extending something you've created that's easy to work with and that you have an idea, you're like, how can I hack this into it to make it do what I need to do? Sure. So we've talked a little bit about dependencies, and like, have you heard of this company called Tidelift by chance?
No.
So Tidelift I came across is sort of a cool business where basically their whole business model is, hey, a lot of companies use open source, about 92% open source libraries. These companies pay Tidelift to generate money for those. Like, it's a subscription thing where companies pay Tidelift based off their dependencies, as I understand it, and then it promotes the creators to maintain those dependencies. So it's sort of a newer thing. I don't know how long they've been around, but I think the concept's a little bit newer. But I thought that was a pretty cool business idea, especially, very software focused.
Yeah, that is pretty cool. One thing that worries me, and if you've ever worked with an open source project or heard stories of people working with open source projects, like the building blocks of these really cool frameworks we use are usually built upon open source projects. And sometimes those open source projects are built upon other open source projects. And being maintainers of those projects is a full-time job for a lot of these people, because if you get any sort of popularity in one of your open source projects, you're going to get hundreds of comments and issues, and people are going to constantly be wanting for you to fix things and add new features. And it just takes a ton of time to like go through those comments. You're going to get trolls and people complaining, to like moderate those and to pick which features you should work on and not work on, and then actually put the effort in. And then other people can contribute. So you have to look at their pull requests, determine if they're okay or not, and then respond back to them. And then any sort of open source project that's worth its salt usually has a test suite involved that you have to maintain and make sure it works, and make sure all the maintainers it's just a huge pain. So things like Tidelift, from what you're describing, would be awesome because it would help really, make it worth it for those people putting out the cool stuff on the internet that we use.
Yeah, and a lot of times people make the assumption that you're making a lot of money on these open source libraries that are very popularly used. It's usually not the case. Like, I know I use the site caniuse.com to see like browser compatibility, and I'm not sure what they have on there, but I know I checked their Patreon one day when I was on their page. It's like $300 a month, and it's like that site is maintaining so much data, and I have no doubt it's like a full-time job that you just $300 is definitely not worth it to keep it up to date.
I've seen one other, I know we're kind of going off topic here, but I've seen one other way that open source projects do this, which is I kind of find interesting, is they'll have sponsorships. Like Vue.js does this a lot. You can actually support Evan You if you sponsor him on his Patreon. He'll add your company logo to the front page of Vue.js.com. And so he makes like $16,000 a month just because he's able to have the sponsorship model. And then that allows him to work full-time on Vue.js and do all the hard work to keep it up and running. And a lot of other bigger open source projects are doing things like that too.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to end it, unless you got anything else you want to talk about.
No, I just think this episode. I think what we're trying to say is, and Dylan's saying, we're not trying to framework shame anyone. If you want to do one of these things, that's okay. Just keep in mind that try to dig a little deeper in all these frameworks and understand the underlying technology, and make sure if you don't have to pull a framework out or a library out every time you want to add a new modal or add something that iterates through an object a certain way.
Yeah, just make a conscious decision instead of it being your first choice, and decide if it's something that you actually need to use or is something that you just want to use because you think you got to hack something out because the business is going to have deadlines. Business always has deadlines, spoiler alert, and they're always unreasonable. So
Yep.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you want to find more about what I'm up to, go to dylanisrael.com.
And if you want to know what I'm up to, you can check out my website at eric.video. If you haven't already, please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And if you do, you might even be featured on our next episode. Don't forget to check out the website at selftaughtornot.com. From there, you can sign up for a mailing list where we give away free courses and a bunch of cool stuff. And we'll also let you know when the next episode comes out. And finally, if you didn't know, we have a Facebook group. It's called Code, Tech, and Caffeine. We have over 10,000 members. And you can find the link at selftaughtornot.com. So come join us. We have tons of developers willing to help you guys, mentor you guys. Check it out. Just make sure you go to selftaughtornot.com and check out the Code, Tech, and Caffeine link. Thanks, and take care.